Hello everyone, welcome to my channel about writing stuff. My name's Camille and today we're talking about world building, history, and research. Not necessarily in secondary world fantasy, but kind of related. I've been writing a portal fantasy and I feel like portal fantasies are extremely common for writers, and definitely it's a great love of readers because there is this connection to the real world. There is a baseline, a familiar baseline to start at. So for readers, it's you get gently eased into the magic and the supernatural. And for the writer, like I said, it provides that baseline to really kind of work from. But there is a common trope, sort of, in like this portal fantasy, urban fantasy idea where the supernatural element or the hidden world, there's kind of this history or this belief system or how they thought they came into creation that everyone just believes. It is what it is. One famous person or a couple famous people perhaps relay like how this happened, even if it was hundreds of thousands of years ago, and everyone just believes it. There's no debate or other interpretation of these sorts of things to sort of fuel a different religion or a different course of action, yada, yada, yada. So I kind of want to dig into this idea of history and research, how it is in the real world, to give you guys, something to think about. But basically, when it comes to history and people in the real world, who is this primary source? Who wrote this sort of thing? There's a common phrase that whoever wins the war writes history. Basically, in modern times, we don't have the whole story of history. We don't have everyone's perspectives. We don't exactly know certain things. It's what's important, what survived, blah, 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 blah. But what's great about our world is we have historians debating certain things, having theories being debunked, and then this, pulls in science and technology and whatever, but history is relayed through people, and one person's perspective can be just as biased or skewed or subconsciously inflected upon from their religion or their family dynamic or what region they're living in. So it's important in our world not to take everything at face value, and yet that happens on occasion in urban fantasy or in portal fantasy, where there aren't multiple facets or, debates or alternate beliefs happening. It's usually, the main group of good guys believe this one thing that drives them to perhaps go out and do this noble cause. And then there's the one bad guy who just like completely perverts the teachings of this one person who wrote this history or whatever. So some of these stories are really great, but that feels a little shallow to me. So I really want to dig into this idea of history and research that like your characters do in a fantasy world, just in general, in a secondary fantasy world, in an urban fantasy setting or portal fantasy world. So it really comes down to the questions. There are multiple beliefs and debates, and then there are other things that come into play too, like science and technology. So my first example for this is, I think it was 19th century. Some guy took a photograph of a little girl looking at a fairy, and at the time, photography was a new science, a new technology. So, people sort of took like this doctored photograph at face value and said, yep, that's proof fairies exist. None of these people had seen fairies themselves, had never been to the fairy world. A lot of the fairy myth stuff up until that point had been debunked or regarded as a myth and not actually religion. So it's one of those things where it was, of course, debunked later because it was a doctored photograph. But at the time, technology really got in the heads of people and basically said, hey, look, fairies are real. I have this proof, when it really wasn't proof. And as a sidebar, I think portal fantasies are super, just loved by everyone because That is like the oldest form of fantasy. Like all old myths and religions and whatever have like some offset of there's this magical place with weird creatures and there's power and magic and it's different from our world. But anyways, so now when you're writing this sort of thing, all writers, I just did a really long pause, but all writers, take some sort of time to create the history of the world. They do a lot of research, create all of these things. So it's one of those things where you want to include it in your book, but you have to ask yourself two questions. Is all this history relevant to the character at the point in time when you want to introduce it? And is it relevant to the plot? Another example I have for this is, there are a lot of beliefs in this world. For me, I'm a Christian. I believe that God created the world in 7 days. And yet, if someone were to write a story about my life right now, the fact that God created the world in 7 days wouldn't necessarily be relevant to my life on like a daily. Like the story of Noah or the story of Moses wouldn't necessarily be relevant to my life on the daily or like the current plot of like my day-to-day existence. But that part of history would be relevant to me daily in the form of the Christian religion, where I'm actively trying to follow Christ, when I pray, when I bless my food, when I go to church, things like that. And this is where I'm tying it into my old video of world building cultures and religions, where, the history and research and all this sort of stuff changes over time. But that is a good way to make perhaps the history of this fantasy world relevant to your character is it part of the religion? Is it being taught in school or talked about amongst people, etc.? And then another thing too is some of that history bringing up debates? Is there a holy war or political unrest because of some of these beliefs, things that have warped and changed throughout history to cause and bring all this to a head in modern times inside of this fantasy world or inside of this urban fantasy setting? And then, is it relevant to the plot? This is very common in fantasy, and I do enjoy this because in this sort of instance, there are a lot of facets to the history of the world, but, is it part of the mystery, the history of this world? Is it politics? I think this is like the Harry Potter pinnacle where history of this wizarding world is drawn in because it's part of the mystery. But it really comes down to this idea of, it's also really common in Patrick Rothfuss's King Killer Chronicle, where Quoth is, actively doing research and trying to find history because there are multiple perspectives. In that world, no one believes in the Chandrian. They believe it's a fairy myth. It's pretend. It's to scare little children. But Quoth is slowly finding threads saying that this group of people, that they are real, yada, yada, yada. And that comes back around to, in your world, who wrote the history, who won the war, what perspectives are seen, what important things are left behind, because there are or were times in our world's history where there was no pen and paper. People had to chisel things into like tablets or paint things on the walls. What sorts of things written on tablets would be important to last through times? I read an article a while back about, the important things that need to be written down were business ledgers, what money was coming in, what money was going, this sort of thing. So those things lasted through the ages, but not like daily life or dating rituals or meals or that sort of thing. What is important enough to last through the ages? And what sort of topics stir people up enough to where other people would actively try to oppose an argument someone made or try to debunk some sort of proof someone set forward, etc. So it needs to be relevant to the character or the plot. And, how do we make pieces of the history relevant to the character? This is also common in like urban fantasy setting, portal world fantasy, but it's kid goes to magic school. And I personally love writing this because it's fun to explore the magic and the classroom and all this sort of stuff as a writer. But it's, your character needs to care about these sorts of things for the reader to care. So in Harry Potter, for example, we care about the history of the world because Harry needs to know these things to get good marks to move on to the next grade. It's a little bit like surface level because it's so common, but it's a good way to introduce some of this information if it's relevant. Another thing too is like Quoth, the Name of the Wind. He doesn't necessarily learn a lot of the history in school, but he is seeking truth. He has his own personal motivations because of what happened to his family. So he's going out and getting all these different opinions. And that's the main thing. It needs to be relevant to the character or the plot or both. And your character needs to have a motivation to know these things and to find the truth if the truth is what the story is after. If it's a mystery and we need to know the truth of this ancient relic, or we need to know the truth of how this magic exists or why it went away so that we can get it back. If we need to find out the true motivations of this dark overlord, who's actually not a dark overlord, who's actually doing the right things. There are all these different types of plots and characters, but it really comes down to relevance and motivation and your character having agency, going out of their way to move the plot forward because of what they want. So yeah, I feel like this video is so much more rambly. I wanted to do another like world building video because the cultures and religions video is my most viewed video, and it seemed a topic that resonated with people because they weren't finding that sort of information elsewhere. But basically what it comes down to is that, people are liars, or they're biased, or their opinions are skewed, but we in modern times get information about the history of our world from sources who are just people like us, just as flawed as us. So you can do that in your world where, your characters are taking things at face value because it's literally just another person telling you these things. And there can be multiple different recounts of certain situations or battles, several different religions branching off of like creation, belief of creation, all this sort of stuff. And then what that motivates in modern times. The Christian religion, a lot of religious wars have been motivated through that. But then a lot of love and generosity has been motivated through that too. So it's really digging into it and then it's knowing these things as the writer and introducing them into the story as they become relevant or as your character is motivated to do research or learn more, etc. So sorry I've been super MIA lately. I just got back from Minnesota for a funeral, and it feels like that kind of season where all the writer things are happening. I don't know if it's because like the sun is kind of coming out, but not really because it's still like snowing and raining everywhere. So I don't know. But yeah, I'll try to keep making more videos. Please request things in the comments. Please just request things in the comments. I don't have a resource today because I suck, but I'll see you guys next week, hopefully. And, as always, you should be writing, researching, writing history, outlining, all that kind of stuff. Bye.